Sometimes the hardest part of being a parent isn't putting food on the table. It's watching your child grow up without a place to call home. Mark knew that feeling too well. After years of moving from one rental to another, he bought a mountain cabin for $100. Everyone warned him it was cursed. The roof leaked, the floorboards creaked, and locals crossed the street rather than talk about it. But it was theirs. Then his daughter Ivy found something in the attic, a sealed panel covered in strange symbols that no one in town would go near. When she opened it, what she found wasn't a ghost. It was letters, maps, and secrets that had been hidden for 70 years. But why had an entire town agreed to keep silent? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mark Corrigan had learned to measure his life in small victories. A warm meal, a safe place to sleep. His daughter's smile when she didn't think he was watching. For 2 years, those victories had been few and far between. He folded the discharge papers one more time, though the creases had worn thin from handling. Honorable discharge. 12 years of service as a military pilot. It should have meant something more than this bouncing between cheap motels and sleeping in his truck when the money ran out. But Sarah's medical bills had taken everything, and after she passed, there was nothing left but grief and debt. Ivy sat beside him in the passenger seat, her backpack clutched on her lap like it held everything she owned. It did. She was 11 now, tall for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and his stubborn jaw. She hadn't complained once in 2 years. Not when they left their apartment. Not when they spent 3 weeks on his buddy's couch. Not when they ate gas station sandwiches for dinner because that's all he could afford. Is it much further? She asked, voice quiet. Just over this ridge, Mark said, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The truck rattled over another pothole, and he sent up a silent prayer that the engine would hold together long enough to get them. There, the cabin appeared through the pine. Trees like something out of a faded photograph. Small, weathered. The roof sagged in the middle, and one of the front windows was boarded up with plywood. But it had 4 walls and a door that locked, and for $100. It was theirs. Mark had seen the listing online 3 weeks ago. Mountain cabin, as is. Cash only, $100. He'd called the number expecting a scam. Instead, he got a lawyer named David Finch, who sounded almost relieved when Mark said he'd take it. You're sure? Finch had asked. It's been empty for a long time. The town keeps it maintained just enough to prevent collapse, but no one lives there. Why not? A pause. It has a reputation. People say it's better left alone. Mark didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in roofs and walls and a place his daughter could call home. He'd driven to the lawyer's office that same day with 5 $20 bills. Now, standing in front of the cabin with Ivy beside him, he felt the weight of that decision. The afternoon sun filtered through the pines, casting long shadows across the clearing. The air smelled of pine resin and old wood. It was quiet in a way that city noise never prepared you for, the kind of silence that made you aware of your own breathing. It's perfect, Dad, Ivy said, and he could hear her trying to mean it. It needs work, he admitted, but it's ours. They spent the first hour unloading the truck. Everything they owned fit in the back. 2 duffel bags of clothes, a box of kitchen supplies, Ivy's books, and his tools. Mark had sold almost everything else to pay for Sarah's last months in hospice. Inside, the cabin was musty but solid. One main room served as kitchen and living space, with a wood stove in the corner and a sink that groaned when he turned the faucet. 2 small bedrooms branched off the main room, and a narrow staircase led to an attic. The floorboards creaked under his weight, but they didn't give. Which room do you want? Mark asked. Ivy chose the smaller bedroom, the one with a window facing east. I can watch the sunrise, she said, setting her backpack on the bare mattress frame they'd found inside. That night, they ate canned soup heated on a camping stove while the wood stove crackled in the corner. The roof leaked in 2 places, and Mark set out buckets to catch the drips. But they were warm, and they were together, and when Ivy fell asleep on her mattress pad, Mark sat in the main room and let himself believe they'd finally found something stable. The town of Pine Ridge was 10 miles down the mountain, nestled in a valley where the peaks gave way to rolling hills. Population maybe 800, with one main street that held everything you needed: a general store, a diner, a post office, and a gas station that doubled as a mechanic shop. Mark drove down the next morning to get supplies. The general store was the kind of place that hadn't changed in 50 years. Wood floors, shelves stocked with canned goods and basic necessities, and a woman at the counter who looked at him with open curiosity. "You're the one who bought the Corrigan place," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's right. Mark Corrigan." He extended his hand. She hesitated before shaking it. "Vera Hastings. I run the store. Nice to meet you. I'm looking for some basic supplies. Food, batteries, maybe some tarps for the roof." Vera studied him for a long moment. "You planning to stay?" "That's the idea. People don't usually stay at that cabin. Not for long." Mark had heard variations of this since he'd arrived. The lawyer's warning. The gas station attendant who'd raised his eyebrows when Mark mentioned where he was living. Now this woman with her careful words and worried eyes. "Why is that?" he asked. Vera turned back to the register, ringing up his items with deliberate slowness. "It's been in your family a long time. Built by a man with the same last name as yours back in the 40s. He disappeared, and the cabin sat empty. Town bought it for back taxes, but no one wanted to live there. People say it's not right, that place." "What do you mean, not right?" "Just stories. You know how small towns are." She bagged his supplies, then looked at him directly. "You have family with you?" "My daughter. She's 11. Something shifted in Vera's expression. Concern, maybe, or sadness. "You be careful up there, especially in the attic. Some things are sealed up for a reason." Mark wanted to ask more, but a customer came in behind him, and Vera turned her attention away. He loaded the supplies into his truck, troubled by the conversation, but not sure what to make of it. Over the next 2 weeks, they settled into a rhythm. Mark found work doing odd jobs around town, fixing fences, repairing engines, anything that paid cash. His military training made him useful, and people appreciated a man who knew his way around tools. Ivy explored the property, climbing trees and following deer trails through the woods. They met the neighbor, a quiet man named Carl, who lived a mile down the ridge and checked in on them once a week. "Good to see someone living there again," Carl said, though his eyes held the same caution Mark had seen in Vera's. The sheriff, a man named Roy Dalton, stopped by on their 3rd day. He was in his 50s, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors. "Just checking in," Dalton said, standing on the porch. "Making sure you folks are settling in all right." "We're fine," Mark said. "Appreciate you stopping by. You need anything, you let me know." Dalton glanced at the cabin, his expression unreadable. "That place has a history. If you start noticing anything unusual, don't hesitate to call." "What kind of unusual?" Dalton shrugged. "Just keep an eye out." It was all vague warnings and half-finished sentences. Mark understood small-town suspicion. He'd grown up in a place like this before the military took him away. But there was something else here, something nobody wanted to say directly. At night, lying on his own mattress pad and listening to the wind move through the pines, Mark thought about the cabin's history. A man with his last name had built this place 80 years ago. The same man who disappeared. Corrigan wasn't a common name. It was possible, likely, even that they were related somehow. He'd never known much about his father's side of the family. His dad had left when Mark was 6, and his mother never talked about the Corrigan line. Nothing good comes from looking backward, she used to say. But here he was, living in a cabin built by someone who might have been his grandfather or great-uncle, surrounded by people who treated the place like it carried a curse. Mark didn't believe in curses. He believed in hard work and second chances. This cabin was their second chance, and he wasn't going to let small-town superstitions scare him away from the first real home they'd had in 2 years. 3 weeks into their new life, Mark started to believe they might actually make it work. He'd picked up enough odd jobs to cover groceries and gas, and Ivy had adjusted better than he'd hoped. She'd even made a friend, a girl from town whose mother ran the diner. The afternoon the storm rolled in. Mark was in Pine Ridge picking up lumber to patch the worst sections of the roof. Dark clouds gathered over the peaks, moving fast, and he hurried home before the roads got slick. Ivy was supposed to stay in her room doing homework. He told her a dozen times to stay out of the attic. The stairs were old, and he hadn't had time to check if they were safe. But Ivy had her mother's curiosity and his stubbornness, and rules only worked when someone was watching. She stood at the base of the attic stairs for 10 minutes before climbing them. The steps creaked under her weight, but they held. At the top, the attic opened into a long, narrow space that ran the length of the cabin. Afternoon light filtered through gaps in the roof boards, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Old furniture crowded the space. A broken chair, a trunk filled with moth-eaten blankets, stacks of yellowing newspapers. Ivy moved carefully, testing each floorboard before putting her weight on it. The air smelled of dust and old wood and something else she couldn't quite identify, like the way libraries smelled. Old paper and forgotten time. She found the panel by accident, bumping into a stack of boxes that shifted to reveal a section of wall that didn't match the rest. While the other walls were rough-hewn logs, this section was smooth planking, fitted together with precision, and covering it carved directly into the wood were symbols that made her pause. They weren't the random scratches of someone marking time. These were deliberate, careful designs. Circles and lines that form patterns. At first, Ivy thought they might be some kind of occult symbols, the kind of thing that would make sense in a cursed cabin. But as she traced them with her fingers, she recognized shapes, a shield, an eagle, numbers that could have been dates, military insignia. Her dad had enough patches and pins from his service that she recognized the basic forms. The panel was held in place by a rusted padlock, old enough that the metal had oxidized to a deep orange brown. Ivy tried pulling on it, but it held fast. She ran back downstairs and grabbed her father's toolbox. Returning with a pry bar and hammer. It took 15 minutes of careful work. She didn't want to damage whatever was behind the panel, just break the lock. When the rusted hasp finally gave way with a metallic snap, Ivy held her breath and pulled the panel open. Inside was a space about 3 feet wide and 4 feet deep, carved between the wall studs. And sitting in that space was a metal box, the kind she'd seen in antique stores, military issue, with reinforced corners and a clasp that still worked smoothly despite the decades. Ivy lifted it out. Heavy, but manageable. She set it on the floor and opened the clasp. Inside were papers, lots of them, letters, mostly tied together with string that crumbled when she touched it. Photographs in black and white, edges yellowed with age. Maps that had been folded and refolded until the creases threatened to tear through. And at the very top, a set of dog tags on a chain that had lost its shine. She picked up the dog tags, turning them to catch the light. The name stamped into the metal made her freeze. Corrigan, D. 1920 to 1943. Service number. Blood type. Religion. The same last name as her father. Ezer. Ivy's hands trembled as she set the dog tags aside and picked up the first letter. The handwriting was careful, practiced, the kind of penmanship they didn't teach anymore. It was dated June 15th, 1943, and began, "My dearest Margaret, I hope this letter finds you well. The work here continues, though I cannot speak of it in detail. Know that I think of you every moment and dream of the day I can return home to our cabin in the mountains." She read 3 more letters, each one revealing a little more. Daniel Corrigan had been stationed somewhere in Colorado during the war. He was part of the Army Corps of Engineers, working on what he called geological surveys, though he hinted it was something more important. He wrote about the beauty of the mountains, about the local families he'd met, about his hope that the war would end soon and he could come home. The last letter in the bundle was different. The handwriting was hurried, less careful. Dated October 1943, it read, "If you are reading this, then I did not make it home as I promised. Know that I loved you more than words can express. What we found here, what they're doing, it's not right. I've tried to document everything, to leave a record. The others don't know what we've done. They don't understand the cost. I pray someone will find this and finish what we started. Tell our son I'm sorry. Tell him his father tried to do the right thing." The letter ended there, unsigned. Ivy sat in the dusty attic, surrounded by papers and photographs, and tried to process what she'd found. Her great-grandfather, maybe? Or great-great-grandfather. The dates would make sense. Born in 1920, died in 1943. That would make him only 23. When he wrote that last letter, she picked up one of the photographs. 5 young men in military uniforms, standing in front of a building she didn't recognize. They looked impossibly young, barely older than teenagers. One of them, standing in the center, had the same strong jaw and dark eyes she saw in her father's face every day. Thunder rumbled outside, and rain began pattering against the roof. Ivy realized she'd lost track of time. Her dad would be home soon, and she needed to show him this. She gathered everything carefully. The letters, the photographs, the maps, the dog tags, and placed them back in the metal box. Then she carried the box downstairs and set it on the kitchen table, just as she heard. The truck pulling up outside, Mark came through the door, shaking rain from his jacket, his arms full of lumber. He stopped when he saw her face. "Ivy, what's wrong?" "I found something," she said quietly, "in the attic, behind a sealed panel." Mark set down the lumber, his expression shifting from concern to confusion. "I told you to stay out of the attic." "I know. I'm sorry. But Dad, you need to see this." She opened the box and held up the dog tags. Mark crossed the room slowly, taking the dog tags from her hand. He stared at the names stamped in the metal, his face going pale. "Corrigan," he whispered. "Daniel Corrigan. I think he might be your grandfather," Ivy said, "or great-grandfather. The dates would work out." Mark picked up one of the photographs, the one with the 5 soldiers. His hands weren't quite steady. "This man, the one in the middle. He looks like you," Ivy finished. "I thought so too." Mark sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, still holding the photograph. "My mother's maiden name was Corrigan. She never talked about her father. Said he died before she was born during the war. But she never told me how, or where, or anything about him. He built this cabin," Ivy said, "and he hid all of this before he died. Dad, something happened here. Something bad enough that he felt like he needed to leave a record." Mark spread the papers across the table, letters, maps, photographs. The rain drummed harder against the roof, and lightning flickered through the windows. He picked up the last letter, the one that ended with, "Tell him his father tried to do the right thing," and read it twice. "What did you find?" he asked quietly. "What were you hiding, Daniel?" Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains, and the cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for them to uncover the truth it had kept sealed for 70 years. The storm passed by midnight, leaving the air clean and cold. Mark didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with the letters spread before him, reading by lamplight while Ivy slept in her room. Each letter revealed a little more about Daniel Corrigan, a young man who'd volunteered for service, been assigned to the Corps of Engineers, and found himself stationed in the mountains of Colorado, doing work he couldn't fully describe. The early letters were full of hope and homesickness. Daniel wrote about Margaret, his new wife, and their plans for the cabin he was building. He described the landscape with genuine affection, the way the peaks caught the sunrise, the clarity of the mountain air, the silence that felt like peace. But as the months progressed, the tone changed. June turned to July, July to August, and Daniel's words grew more troubled. "The work we're doing here troubles my conscience," he wrote in late July. "We've been surveying the mountains for strategic minerals, but the methods, I cannot speak of them in detail, but know that they weigh heavily on my soul." In August, he mentioned names: Lieutenant Graves, Sergeant Wilson, Private Hutchins, Corporal U. "We are 5 men who see what's happening and understand the cost. The others follow orders without question, but we've begun to document everything, to keep a record of what's being done here." Mark found a photograph tucked between 2 letters. 5 men in uniform, the same photo Ivy had shown him. He studied each face, committing them to memory. These were the men Daniel had trusted, the ones who'd seen what he'd seen. The final letters were the most disturbing. September brought references to the families and the relocation. Daniel wrote, "They're removing people from their homes, burning their houses, erasing any trace they were ever here. The government claims it's temporary, necessary for the war effort, but I've seen the mining company representatives. They were here before the families were even gone. This was planned. This is theft dressed up as patriotism." October's single letter was the one Ivy had read the final message. The apology, the plea for someone to finish what they'd started. When dawn broke, Mark's eyes were gritty with exhaustion, but his mind was clear. Daniel Corrigan hadn't been a deserter or a coward. He'd been a man who'd tried to stand up against something wrong, and it had cost him everything. Ivy found him still at the table when she woke up. "Did you sleep at all?" "Couldn't," Mark admitted. "There's too much here. Too many questions. What do we do?" Mark looked at his daughter, 11 years old, already too familiar with hardship, but still believing the world could be fair. "We find out what happened. Your great-grandfather wanted someone to know the truth. I think we owe him that." They spent the morning organizing everything. Mark created a timeline based on the letters, tracking Daniel's growing disillusionment from June through October 1943. Ivy sorted the photographs, labeling each one with whatever information they could glean from the letters. The maps were military survey charts, hand-marked with symbols and notations. Mark recognized the tactical markings from his own training positions, elevations, strategic points. But there were other marks too, circled locations labeled Site A through Site E with cryptic notes about mineral deposits and structural integrity. "We need more information," Mark said. "The library in town should have historical records. If there was a military operation here in 1943, there should be some documentation." The Pine Ridge Library was a small building next to the post office, run by a woman named Dorothy Winters, who looked at them with the same cautious expression everyone in town seemed to have. But when Mark asked about local history from the 1940s, she led them to a back room with file cabinets and old newspaper archives. "We don't get many people interested in that period," Dorothy said. "What are you looking for specifically?" "Military operations during World War II, Corps of Engineers, geological surveys, anything like that." Something flickered in Dorothy's expression. "May I ask why?" Mark hesitated, then pulled out one of the photographs. "This man was Daniel Corrigan. He was my grandfather, and he was stationed here in 1943. I'm trying to understand what happened to him." Dorothy stared at the photograph for a long moment. "The Corrigan boy," she whispered. I wondered if someone would eventually come asking, "You know about him?" Everyone in Pine Ridge knows about him, or knew about him. Most of the people who were alive then are gone now. She sat down heavily in one of the chairs. My mother was here during the war. She never talked about it much, but I remember her saying something once about soldiers and families and things that weren't right. What families? Dorothy shook her head. I don't know the details. Just whispers. Things children hear but don't understand until they're older. She stood up and pulled out a folder from one of the cabinets. These are the newspaper archives from 1943. You're welcome to look through them. But I should warn you, there are gaps. Several months' worth of papers are missing. Mark opened the folder. The Pine Ridge Gazette, a weekly publication, had fairly complete records for most of 1943, but starting in late September and continuing through December, there were no papers at all. What happened to them? Ivy asked. Lost, supposedly. Water damage in the basement storage. But that's a convenient explanation, isn't it? Dorothy looked at them both. Be careful with this. There are people in town who don't want old stories dug up. Not because they're bad people, but because sometimes the past is painful. They spent 3 hours in the library, reading through what records existed. The Gazette mentioned the military presence in passing, corps of engineers conducting surveys in the region, government work supporting the war effort, but nothing specific. The gap in the archives covered exactly the period when Daniel's letters became most troubled. Mark found one interesting reference in an August edition. Local families relocating temporarily to support strategic operations. Town council expresses gratitude for their patriotic sacrifice. Relocating, Mark read aloud. That's what Daniel wrote about. The families being moved. Ivy pulled out another newspaper, this one from June. Dad, look at this. It was a photograph accompanying a story about a community gathering. In the background, barely visible, was a group of people standing near a building. The caption read, Local Arapaho families attend summer celebration before temporary location. Mark felt something cold settle in his stomach. Arapaho families, indigenous people. They were living here, Ivy said quietly. And the government moved them. The pieces were starting to come together, but Mark needed more. He asked Dorothy about town historians or anyone who might remember that period. She gave him a name, Dr. Andrew Sterling, a retired physician in his 80s who'd lived in Pine Ridge his entire life. He doesn't talk much about the war years, Dorothy warned. But if anyone would know, it's him. They found Dr. Sterling's house on the edge of town, a well-maintained cottage with a garden that suggested careful attention. The old man who answered the door was tall and thin, with white hair and sharp blue eyes that assessed them immediately. You're the ones living in the Corrigan cabin, he said, before Mark could introduce himself. Yes, sir. Mark Corrigan. This is my daughter, Ivy. We were hoping you might answer some questions about my grandfather, Daniel Corrigan. Sterling's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. I wondered how long it would take. Come in. The house was filled with books and photographs, the home of someone who'd spent a lifetime collecting memories. Sterling led them to a study and gestured for them to sit. I was 15 in 1943. He began without preamble. Old enough to remember, young enough that adults spoke freely around me. Your grandfather was a good man caught in a bad situation. What situation? Mark asked. The government found uranium in these mountains. Critical for the war effort, they said, but there were people living on the land where the deposits were richest. Northern Arapaho families who'd been here for generations. The military came in, declared it a strategic necessity, and moved them out. Forcibly? Sterling nodded slowly. They called it voluntary temporary relocation. But there was nothing voluntary about it. The families were given 2 weeks to pack up and leave. Their homes were burned to prevent them from returning. Promises were made compensation the right to return after the war, but none of it was honored. And my grandfather? Daniel and a few others in his unit saw what was happening. They tried to document it, to create a record. There were whispers that they planned to expose the operation. Sterling's face grew grave. In October 1943, there was an accident. 3 soldiers died training exercise gone wrong, the official report said. Daniel Corrigan was listed as a deserter who disappeared shortly after. Mark felt Ivy's hand slip into his. But he didn't desert. No, Sterling said quietly. He came back to his cabin, hid everything he documented, and then he disappeared. My father was the town doctor at the time. He told me years later that he'd been called to examine a body found in the mountains, officially listed as a hiking accident. But my father said the injuries weren't consistent with the fall. The room was silent, except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel. They killed him, Mark said. It wasn't a question. I can't prove it, Sterling replied. No one can, after all these years. But 3 soldiers die in a convenient accident, and the one who tried to come home ends up dead in the woods. That's not coincidence. That's covering tracks. Mark spent that night staring at the maps Daniel had hidden. The marked locations, Site A through Site E, were scattered across the mountains surrounding Pine Ridge. Each one had notations in Daniel's careful handwriting. Elevation, coordinates, estimates of mineral density. But there were other notes too, ones that suggested Daniel had been there personally, had seen what was being done. Site A, primary excavation. Families relocated 9/15. Structures demolished 9/18. By morning, Mark had made a decision. We're going to Site A, he told Ivy over breakfast. I need to see what's there. Is it far? About 5 miles from here, according to the coordinates. We can make it in a few hours if we start early. They packed the light water, snacks, Mark's compass, and GPS unit, and Daniel's map carefully sealed in a plastic bag. The morning was cool and clear, perfect for hiking. Mark had spent enough time in the mountains during his military training that he felt comfortable navigating the terrain, and Ivy had proven herself capable over the past weeks of exploring near the cabin. The trail started easy, following an old logging road that had grown over with grass and wildflowers. But after the first mile, it became rougher, winding up through pine forest and over rocky outcrops. Mark took his time, teaching Ivy how to read the landscape, how to find the easiest path, how to preserve energy for the long haul. This is what they taught us in survival training, he explained. The mountains don't care about your plans. You have to respect them, work with them. Did you do a lot of mountain training? Some. More desert work, actually. Afghanistan, Iraq. But the principles are the same. Pay attention. Stay aware. Don't take unnecessary risks. They reached Site A just before noon. Mark recognized it immediately from Daniel's description. A small valley cupped between 2 ridges, with a stream running through the center. But what should have been pristine wilderness showed clear signs of human interference. The foundation stones of buildings were still visible, though mostly buried under 70 years of soil and vegetation. Mark counted at least 4 separate structures arranged in a rough semicircle. Near the stream, he found remnants of what might have been a garden still visible terracing where crops had once grown. People lived here, Ivy said softly, running her hand over one of the stones. This was someone's home, multiple families, by the look of it. Mark walked the perimeter, taking photographs with his phone, noting details. At the far end of the valley, he found evidence of the mining operation, a collapsed entrance to a tunnel, surrounded by broken equipment and rusted metal. Warning signs, faded but still legible, proclaimed, "Danger, unstable ground, nitrogen monoxide entry." But what caught his attention was the deliberate nature of the destruction. The tunnel hadn't collapsed naturally and had been filled in, sealed with concrete and rebar. Someone had gone to considerable effort to make sure no one would enter it again. Ivy found something in the rubble near one of the foundations, a military-issue compass. Brass casing tarnished green with age. Engraved on the back were the initials, DC. Mark took it from her hands, feeling the weight of it. His grandfather had stood in this exact spot 70 years ago, had watched as families were forced from their homes, had documented everything with the tools of his trade. And then he'd hidden this compass here, a marker for anyone who might follow. He wanted someone to find this, Mark said. He left a trail. They spent another hour exploring, finding more evidence of the families who'd lived here. Pieces of pottery, a rusted stove, the frame of what might have been a water pump. Each artifact was a piece of someone's life, abandoned or destroyed in the name of national security. On the hike back, Ivy was quiet, processing what they'd seen. Finally, she asked, "What happened to the families? Where did they go?" "I don't know," Mark admitted, "but I intend to find out." That evening, after Ivy was asleep, Mark began searching online. He started with Northern Arapaho tribal history, reading about the tribe's presence in Colorado during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Many had been forcibly relocated to reservations in Wyoming and Oklahoma during the 1800s, but some families had remained, living in remote mountain valleys. He found references to wartime relocations in the 1940s, but the information was sparse and carefully worded. Some families voluntarily relocated to support strategic operations, was the standard phrasing. Nothing about force, nothing about broken promises, nothing about homes destroyed. Mark tried searching for Daniel Corrigan's military records. As a veteran himself, he had access to certain databases, but he hit walls almost immediately. Daniel's service record existed, but key portions were redacted or missing. His discharge status was listed as other than honorable desertion, with a note that he disappeared in October 1943 and was presumed deceased. There was no mention of an investigation. No details about how or where his body had been found. Nothing about the hiking accident Dr. Sterling had mentioned. Mark pushed back from the computer, frustrated. 70 years of bureaucracy and deliberate obfuscation had buried the truth as effectively as concrete had sealed that mine entrance. His phone rang. Sheriff Dalton's name appeared on the screen. "Evening, Mark," the sheriff said when he answered. "Got a minute?" "Sure. What can I do for you?" "I heard you and your daughter were up at the old mining sites today. Call mentioned seeing you heading that way." Mark felt a prickle of unease. "Just doing some hiking. Showing Ivy the area." "Right." A pause. "Listen, I know you found some things in that cabin. Old letters, family history. That's understandable. You want to know about your grandfather. But I need to ask you to be careful about stirring things up." "Stirring what up, exactly?" "Old memories. Painful ones. There are people in this town whose families were involved in what happened back then. Not bad people, Mark. Just people who were following orders, doing what they thought was right at the time. Digging all that up, it doesn't help anyone." "What about the families who were displaced?" Mark asked quietly. "Doesn't help them?" Silence on the other end. Then, what happened was wrong. Most people here would agree with that, privately. But it was 70 years ago. The people responsible are dead. The families are gone. What good does it do to resurrect all that pain? "The families aren't gone," Mark said. "Their descendants are still alive. And they never got justice." Another long pause. "How do you know that?" Mark realized he'd said too much. "Just a guess, based on what I've been reading." "Mark, I'm not trying to threaten you. I'm trying to protect you. There are interests, corporate interests, that would prefer this history stay buried. The mining company that operates in these mountains now, they're built on leases granted back in the 40s. If those leases were based on fraudulent land seizures, well, that's billions of dollars in question. So that's what this is about. Money. It's about a lot of things. Jobs, families, the economic stability of this entire region. I'm asking you, as a friend, to think carefully about what you're doing." The call ended, leaving Mark staring at his phone. The sheriff hadn't directly threatened him, but the message was clear. Keep digging, and there would be consequences. Mark pulled out Daniel's journal again, the one piece he hadn't yet read thoroughly. It was small, leather-bound, the kind of field journal soldiers carried for personal notes. He'd saved it for last, somehow knowing it would contain the most important information. The first entries were mundane daily observations, weather notes, sketches of the landscape. But as Mark flipped through the pages, the content grew more detailed and more damning. June 14, 1943. Met with the tribal elder today. A man named Joseph Running Bear. He showed me the boundaries of his family's land. Told me stories of his grandfather who first settled this valley. He knows we're surveying for minerals. He's afraid of what comes next. I tried to assure him the government would be fair. I'm not sure I believe my own words. July 3, 1943. Orders came through. The deposit is confirmed uranium, high quality, extensive. Mining company representatives arrived yesterday. They're already talking about timelines and extraction methods. No one has told the families yet. August 1st, 1943. They told the families today. 2 weeks to pack and leave. Joseph Running Bear tried to negotiate. Showed them the deed to his land going back to 1889. They dismissed it, said wartime. Emergency powers supersede property rights. Margaret wept when I told her what I'd witnessed. I've never felt so ashamed of my uniform. September 18th, 1943. The houses are burning. I can see the smoke from here. Wilson U. Hutchins and I have been photographing everything. We're keeping duplicate records, hiding them in multiple locations. If something happens to us, someone needs to know what was done here. October 7th, 1943. Lieutenant Graves discovered what we've been doing. He's threatening court-martial if we don't turn over all documentation. Wilson stood up to him, said we were documenting history, not committing treason. 2 days later, Wilson was dead. Training accident, they said. His parachute failed to open. Wilson had packed his own chute for 5 years without issue. October 12th, 1943. You and Hutchins are dead too. Vehicle crash on the mountain road. 3 men who knew the truth, gone in 5 days. I'm next. I've hidden everything I can, the photographs, the documents, the evidence. It's all in the cabin now, sealed away. If they're reading this, it means I didn't make it. Tell Margaret I love her. Tell my son his father tried. The journal ended there, mid-page. As though Daniel had been interrupted while writing, Mark sat in the darkness, holding his grandfather's final words, and understood the weight of what he'd uncovered. This wasn't just family history. This was documented evidence of conspiracy, murder, and land theft, all committed under the cover of wartime necessity. And somewhere out there, the descendants of Joseph Running Bear were still waiting for justice that had never come. Mark knew he needed to find the Running Bear family, but he didn't know where to start. The next morning, he called the Northern Arapaho Tribal Headquarters in Wyoming. After being transferred 3 times, he finally reached someone who listened to his story. Joseph Running Bear. The woman on the phone repeated, "Let me check our records." Mark waited, hearing the click of keyboard keys. Ivy sat across from him, watching with the intensity of someone who understood they were at a turning point. "I have a Joseph Running Bear in our historical records," the woman said. Born 1889, died 1967. He was one of the elders who testified before Congress in the 1950s about land claims in Colorado. Is there family? Descendants? His grandson still lives on the reservation. Nathan Running Bear. He's 82 now, but sharp as they come. Would you like his contact information? Mark's hand shook slightly as he wrote down the number. "Thank you. This means a lot. May I ask what this is about?" "Justice," Mark said. 70 years overdue. He called Nathan Running Bear that afternoon. The phone rang 6 times before a voice answered, deep and measured. "This is Nathan." "Mr. Running Bear, my name is Mark Corrigan. I'm calling about my grandfather, Daniel Corrigan, and your grandfather, Joseph Running Bear. I believe they knew each other in 1943. A long silence. Then, "Where are you calling from?" "Pine Ridge, Colorado. I'm living in my grandfather's cabin." The cabin. Nathan's voice held something Mark couldn't quite identify: surprise, perhaps, or recognition. Someone finally opened the room. Mark felt his heart rate quicken. "You know about it. My grandfather told us the story before he died. Said there was a soldier, a good man, who tried to help, who documented what was done to us. He said that soldier hid everything in his cabin, sealed it up, hoping someone would find it someday." A pause. "My grandfather spent 40 years trying to reclaim our land. Died never seeing it happen. The government said we didn't have sufficient proof of ownership, that the wartime relocation was legal and proper." "I have the proof," Mark said. "Photographs, documents, my grandfather's journal. Everything that shows what really happened." The silence stretched so long Mark thought the connection had dropped. Then he heard Nathan's voice, thick with emotion. "Can you bring them here? I need to see them with my own eyes. Better than that, I'd like to bring them to you and your family. This isn't just my grandfather's story. It's your family's story, too." They arranged to meet at the Northern Arapaho Reservation in 3 days. Mark spent those days making copies of everything, organizing the materials chronologically, preparing a presentation that would honor both Daniel's courage and the running, their family's loss. Ivy helped him create a timeline on poster board, mapping out the events of 1943 with photographs and excerpts from the letters. Looking at it laid out that way, the full scope of the injustice became undeniable. The drive to Wyoming took 6 hours. Mark and Ivy left before dawn, the metal box of documents secured in the back seat. As they crossed into the reservation, Mark felt the weight of what they were carrying, not just papers and photographs, but the voice of people who'd been silenced for 7 decades, thought Nathan. Running Bear's home was a modest house on the edge of the reservation, with a view of mountains that reminded Mark of Pine Ridge. The old man who opened the door was tall and lean, with long white hair pulled back in a braid and eyes that missed nothing. "Mark Corrigan," he said, not a question. "You have your grandfather's face. That's what people tell me. This is my daughter, Ivy." Nathan shook her hand with the same gravity he'd shown Mark. "Come in. My family is waiting." Inside, the living room was filled with people, Nathan's children and grandchildren. Tribal council members, an elderly woman introduced as Nathan's sister, Ruth. They looked at Mark and Ivy with expressions that mixed hope and suspicion, as though they'd been disappointed too many times to trust easily. Mark set the metal box on the coffee table. "Before I show you what's inside, I want to say something. My grandfather was complicit in what happened to your family. He wore the uniform. He followed the orders, even if he eventually tried to fight against them. I can't apologize for choices he made, but I can honor what he tried to do at the end to make sure the truth survived." He opened the box and began laying out the contents. The dog tags first, then the photographs. The images of families being removed from their homes drew gasps from the assembled group. Ruth began crying silently, and one of the younger women put an arm around her. "That's my grandmother," Ruth said, pointing to a photograph of a woman standing beside a small house. "That's her, right there. I'd know her anywhere from the picture we have." Mark showed them Daniel's journal next, reading passages aloud. When he reached the entry about Joseph Running Bear, showing Daniel the land boundaries, Nathan closed his eyes. "My grandfather kept a journal too," Nathan said quietly. "Want to hear what he wrote about your grandfather?" He left the room and returned with a worn notebook, opening to a marked page. "The young soldier Daniel came to see me today," he read. "He's troubled by what his commanders are planning. I can see in his eyes that he knows what they're doing is wrong. He promised to document everything, to create a record. I told him I appreciated his courage, but that courage often comes with a price. I fear for him." The room was silent except for Ruth's quiet weeping. Mark pulled out the maps next, showing the marked locations of the mining sites and the displaced settlements. Site A through Site E, 5 separate communities, all removed within a 6-week period. My grandfather documented each one. Nathan studied the maps, his expression hardening. "This land, all of it, belonged to our families. The deeds go back to the 1880s, when the government allocated parcels to tribal members. Those deeds were supposed to be permanent, protected by treaty." "Do you still have the deeds?" Mark asked. "Copies. The originals were lost during the relocation." "Convenient, isn't it?" One of the tribal council members, a younger man named Martin, spoke up. "We've tried multiple times to pursue the land claim. Every legal avenue has been blocked. Without the original documents proving ownership, and without evidence that the relocation was fraudulent rather than a legitimate wartime necessity, we have no standing." "What if I told you my grandfather hid the original documents?" Mark said. "Government correspondence, mining company communications, evidence that the uranium discovery was known months before the official survey. Proof that the entire relocation was planned as a way to seize the land." The room erupted in conversation, everyone talking at once. Nathan held up a hand for silence. "Where are these documents?" he asked, still hidden. "My grandfather mentioned in his journal that he sealed them in the cabin's foundation. I haven't found them yet, but I know where to look." Nathan stood, walking to the window. He stared out at the mountains for a long moment. When he turned back, his face was resolute. "My grandfather died believing no one would ever know what was done to us. That the government would get away with it. That the mining companies would profit from their theft. That our family's pain would be forgotten." He looked at Mark directly. "You're saying we have a chance to make this right. I'm saying you deserve the truth. And with that truth, maybe justice. Justice." Nathan said the word like he was testing its weight. "We've survived without justice for 70 years. What makes you think we can get it now?" "Because the mining operations are still ongoing," Mark said. "The company that's working those mountains now, they're operating on leases granted in 1944, based on the land seizure. If we can prove that seizure was fraudulent, their entire legal foundation collapses." Martin leaned forward. "You're talking about billions of dollars in mineral rights. The company won't give that up without a fight." "No," Mark agreed. "They won't. But they'll have to fight in court, in public, with evidence that proves their entire operation is built on stolen land." Nathan sat back down, his hand trembling slightly as he picked up one of the photographs. "This would destroy them. It would certainly damage them. But more importantly, it would restore your family's rightful ownership of that land." Ruth spoke for the first time since seeing her grandmother's photograph. "That land holds our ancestors, our history, our sacred sites. The mining has destroyed so much already, stripped away the earth, poisoned the water. Even if we can't restore what was, we can prevent further harm." The tribal council members conferred quietly. Finally, the eldest among them, a woman named Sarah Blackfeather, spoke. "If you can find those documents, if they prove what you say they prove, the tribe will pursue every legal option. We'll file suit for restoration of our land rights. We'll seek compensation for 70 years of stolen resources. And we'll make sure the world knows what was done to our families." "There's something else you should know," Mark said carefully. "The town of Pine Ridge, most of the people there, their families were here during the relocation. Some participated, some just stayed silent. They're not bad people, but they've built their lives on what happened. The mining company employs half the town. If we expose this, it's going to hurt a lot of innocent people. Nathan nodded slowly. I understand what you're saying. But let me ask you, this is protecting their comfort more important than acknowledging our pain? Is their economic stability worth more than our dignity? Mark had no answer to that. The question hung in the air, demanding a response that he couldn't give. Ivy, who'd been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke. My great-great-grandfather wrote that he hoped someone would finish what he started. I think he knew it wouldn't be easy. I think he knew people would get hurt. But he still thought the truth mattered more. Nathan smiled at her, the first genuine smile Mark had seen from him. Your grandfather would be proud of you, young one. Both of your grandfathers. The drive back to Pine Ridge felt different. Mark carried not just his grandfather's burden now, but the weight of the Running Bear family's hope. Nathan had given him copies of documents they'd preserved, the deed to Joseph's land, photographs of the families before the relocation, testimonies that Joseph had recorded in the 1950s when he tried to fight for their rights. We've been waiting 70 years for someone to care, Nathan had said as they parted. Don't make us wait any longer. Mark returned to the cabin with renewed purpose. If Daniel had hidden the official documents in the foundation, Mark would find them. He spent the next 2 days examining every inch of the cabin structure, tapping walls, checking for hollow spaces, measuring dimensions to see if anything didn't match up. It was Ivy who noticed the discrepancy. Dad, this wall seems thicker than the others. She was right. The interior foundation wall in the main room extended about 6 inches further than it should have, given the exterior measurements. Mark brought in his tools and began carefully removing the stones. Behind the third layer, he found a waterproof military document case, the kind designed to protect sensitive materials in harsh conditions. His hand shook as he opened it. Inside were manila folders, their contents preserved in remarkable condition. Government letterhead, mining company correspondence, internal memos, and most importantly, the original deeds to the Running Bear family holdings 5 separate parcels covering nearly 3,000 acres of mountain land. Mark spread the documents across the table, photographing each one. The paper trail was damning. A memo dated March 1943, 4 months before the official discovery, discussed the uranium deposits and their strategic value. Another from April outlined options for securing the land, including the recommendation to use wartime emergency powers, a letter from a mining company, executive to a military commander offered consulting fees of $50,000, a fortune in 1943 in exchange for expediting the base relocation process. The military commander's response accepted the arrangement, but perhaps the most devastating document was a meeting transcript from September 1943. Government officials, military brass, and mining company representatives discussing how to handle the soldiers who were documenting the operation. The word neutralize appeared 3 times. Mark photographed everything, uploaded copies to secure cloud storage, and sent sets to 3 different people, including Nathan Running Bear and a lawyer friend from his military days. If something happened to him, the evidence would survive. He was sealing the documents back into their case when headlights swept across the cabin windows. A vehicle pulled up outside, not the sheriff's cruiser, but an expensive SUV with tinted windows. Mark put himself between the door and Ivy's room. Stay in your room, he called to her. Lock the door. The knock was polite but firm. Mark opened the door to find a man in his 50s, wearing a tailored suit that looked out of place in the mountains. Behind him stood 2 others, clearly security or corporate lawyers. Mr. Corrigan? I'm Richard Brennan, General Counsel for Summit Mining Corporation. May I come in? Do I have a choice? Of course. But I think you'll want to hear what I have to say. Mark stepped aside, and the 3 men entered. Brennan looked around the cabin with an expression that mixed curiosity and calculation. "You've been asking questions," Brennan began, "about the history of this property, about events from 1943. My client has a legitimate interest in ensuring that historical matters don't create unnecessary complications for ongoing operations. Your client is operating on stolen land," Mark said flatly. Brennan smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That's a serious allegation. The mining leases held by Summit were legally granted by the federal government in 1944, following proper procedures and compensation." "Compensation to whom?" "The families who owned the land were never paid. The deeds were confiscated or destroyed. According to our records, the tribal families voluntarily relocated and were appropriately compensated for temporary displacement during wartime operations." Mark pulled out his phone and showed Brennan one of the photographs. Joseph running bears. Family being forced from their home by armed soldiers. "Does this look voluntary to you?" Brennan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Old photographs can be misleading. Context matters. I have the context. Letters, journals, government memos proving the whole operation was planned fraud. I have the original land deeds. And I have evidence that soldiers who tried to expose this were murdered. Now Brennan's composure cracked slightly. "That's a very serious accusation. Murder? You're talking about events from 80 years ago involving people who are long dead. The crime doesn't expire just because time passes. And the theft is ongoing. Your company has extracted billions in minerals from land that was never legally yours." One of the other men stepped forward. "Mr. Corrigan, let's be reasonable. Summit Mining employs over 400 people in this region. We support schools, hospitals, community programs. If you pursue this crusade, you're not hurting some faceless corporation. You're destroying the livelihoods of your neighbors." "I'm not trying to destroy anything. I'm trying to restore what was stolen." Brennan pulled an envelope from his jacket. "My client has authorized me to make you an offer. $1 million, paid immediately, in exchange for all documents and materials you've collected, and your agreement to cease any further investigation or public discussion of these matters." Mark stared at the envelope. $1 million. Enough to secure Ivy's future, to give her every opportunity he'd never had. Enough to walk away from this fight and let history stay buried. And if I refuse, then Summit will pursue every legal option to protect its interests. We'll challenge your ownership of this cabin. We'll tie you up in litigation for years. And we'll make sure that every court in Colorado knows you're trying to overturn legally established property rights based on dubious historical claims. Brennan's voice hardened. "You're a single father living in poverty, Mr. Corrigan. Can you really afford to fight us? Can you afford for the truth to come out?" Brennan placed the envelope on the table. "Think about your daughter. Think about giving her a stable future instead of dragging her through years of legal battles. The offer stands for 48 hours. After they left, Mark sat at the table staring at the envelope. Ivy emerged from her room, having heard everything through the thin walls. "Are you going to take it?" she asked. "I don't know," Mark admitted. $1 million would change our lives. You could go to any college you wanted. We'd never have to worry about money again. But the Running Bear family would never get their land back. No, they wouldn't." Ivy sat down across from him. "What would great-great-grandpa Daniel do?" Mark thought about the journal entries, about the young soldier who'd risked everything to document the truth. He'd do the right thing. And it cost him his life. Maybe that's why he left everything for us to find, so we could finish it without dying. Mark laughed despite himself. "You're 11. You shouldn't have to think about these things. Mom used to say that hard choices are how we figure out who we really are. Sarah had said that during those last difficult months. when they'd had to decide between treatment that might give or a few more weeks in hospice care that would let her die in peace. They'd chosen peace, and Mark had never regretted it, though it meant saying goodbye sooner. He picked up the envelope and handed it to Ivy. "What do you think we should do?" She held it for a moment, feeling its weight. Then she set it down and pushed it back across the table. "I think we should find out what happened to Wilson, you, and Hutchins. If they were murdered like Grandpa Daniel, their families deserve to know too." Mark felt something loosen in his chest relief, maybe, or pride. His daughter understood something fundamental that $1 million couldn't buy. Some debts could only be paid in truth. Over the next week, Mark tracked down information on the 3 soldiers Daniel had named. Private Alan Wilson had died in a parachute training accident on October 8, 1943. Corporal David. You died in a vehicle crash on October 10th. Sergeant Leonard. Hutchins died in an explosion at the munitions depot on October 11th. 3 men. 3 accidents. 3 days apart. The official reports were brief and formulaic. Signed by the same investigating officer, Lieutenant Frederick Graves. The man Daniel had mentioned as discovering their documentation efforts. Mark found Graves's service record. He'd left the military in 1945 with an honorable discharge and immediately taken a position as Director of Security for Mountain States Mining, the company that later became Summit Mining Corporation. He'd retired in 1978 and died in 1982. The connection was clear, but proving murder 80 years after the fact would be impossible. What mattered now was establishing the pattern, showing that the cover-up had been systematic and violent. Mark called Nathan Running Bear with updates. "We're putting together a legal team," Nathan said. "Tribal attorneys, civil rights lawyers, even some historians who specialize in indigenous land claims. Once we file suit, it's going to be very public. Summit offered me $1 million to go away. Did you take it?" "No, but I wanted you to know they're scared. They wouldn't offer that kind of money if they thought they could win. They should be scared. This isn't just about our family anymore. There are tribes across the country who've had land stolen using similar tactics. If we win, it opens the door for dozens of other claims." After the call, Mark walked out onto the cabin's porch. The sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Somewhere out there, beneath the beauty of these mountains, were the remains of homes and lives destroyed by greed dressed up as patriotism. Daniel had stood on this same porch 80 years ago, knowing that speaking the truth would likely cost him everything. He'd done it anyway, trusting that someday someone would care enough to finish what he'd started. Mark pulled out his phone and typed a message to Brennan. "Tell your client the answer is no. See you in court." He hit send before he could reconsider, then went inside to help Ivy with her homework. They had work to do, and not much time to do it. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. Daniel had been meticulous, documenting everything, hiding materials in multiple locations. The attic panel had held the letters and journals. The foundation had concealed the official documents. But Daniel's final journal entry mentioned hiding everything I can in the cabin plural locations. Multiple caches. He studied the cabin itself with fresh eyes. Built in 1941, 2 years before the relocation. Daniel had constructed it himself, which meant every beam and board had been placed with intention. Ivy found him in the crawl space beneath the cabin at dawn, tapping on foundation stones. "Dad, what are you looking for?" "Your great-great-grandfather was an engineer. He understood structures. If I were him, I wouldn't just hide documents. I'd make the hiding place part of the structure itself." "Like a safe built into a wall?" "Exactly. Help me measure the cabin's exterior dimensions and compare them to the interior." They spent 2 hours with a tape measure. When Mark laid out the measurements, the discrepancy was clear. The cabin's exterior was nearly 8 feet longer than the interior space accounted for. "There's a hidden space," Ivy said. Studying the drawings, Mark crawled back to the far eastern corner where the foundation seemed different. The stones were arranged more precisely, and when he tapped on them, the sound was hollow dot. It took an hour to carefully remove the stones. Behind them was a small chamber carved into the earth and reinforced with timber beams. Inside was another metal case, larger than the first, wrapped in waterproof canvas. Mark's hands trembled as he pulled it out. This was the final piece Daniel had hidden. Inside were documents that changed everything. Land deeds for all 5 displaced communities, proving ownership going back to the 1880s. Each one stamped, notarized, and legally binding. There were mining surveys dated 6 months before the official discovery, detailed geological reports showing the uranium deposits, their estimated value, and recommendations for extraction. Internal government memos discussing how to legally justify the seizure under wartime. Emergency powers. And then Mark found it. A signed agreement between the War Department and Mountain States Mining, dated February 1943, 4 months before the families were told anything. The agreement guaranteed the mining company exclusive rights to the uranium deposits in exchange for covering relocation costs and providing strategic material support to the war effort. Displacement hadn't been a wartime necessity. It had been a business deal, negotiated and finalized before anyone pretended to survey the land. But what made Mark's blood run cold was the list of names at the bottom. 3 government officials, 2 military commanders, and 5 corporate executives. Beside each name was a dollar amount, bribes ranging from $20,000 to $100,000. One of the military commanders was Lieutenant Frederick Graves, the man who'd later become Summit Mining's Director of Security. Mark photographed every document, his hands shaking. This wasn't just historical evidence. This was proof of ongoing fraud. Summit Mining's entire legal claim rested on leases granted as part of this corrupt agreement. He called Nathan immediately. "I found it. Everything. The original deeds, the mining surveys, the bribes, all of it." "How bad is it?" "Worse than we thought." This wasn't bureaucratic bungling or wartime necessity. It was calculated theft from the beginning. Nathan was silent for a long moment. "Send me everything." "There's something else. The current mining operations, they're on the exact parcels your family owned. Site A through Site E, everything they've extracted for the past 70 years belongs to your family. Legally, morally, every ton of uranium, every dollar of profit." Mark could hear voices in the background. Nathan speaking rapidly to someone else. When he came back, his voice was thick with emotion. "My grandfather died believing we'd never prove what was done to us. Mark, what you found, it's more than evidence. It's vindication. It's going to start a war. Summit won't give this up without a massive fight. Let them fight. We've been waiting 70 years. After the call, Mark sat at the table, surrounded by documents representing billions of dollars in disputed claims. Ivy came and sat beside him. "This changes everything, doesn't it?" she asked. "Yes. This proves the Running Bear family owns land that Summit has been mining for decades. That's not a small claim. That's the entire basis of their operation." Mark typed a message to Brennan. "Found the rest of Daniel's evidence. You're going to want to see this before we file it with the court. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., at the cabin. Come alone." The response came within minutes. "I'll be there." The next afternoon, Brennan arrived looking less polished than before, his expression wary. Mark spread the documents across the table without preamble. The original land deeds for all 5 displaced communities. Mining surveys from 6 months before the official discovery. And the February 1943 agreement between the War Department and your predecessor company. The one that shows the entire relocation was planned fraud. Brennan went pale as he read. Mark watched him pick up the bribery list. saw his eyes widen when he recognized the names. Where did you find this? Where my grandfather hid it 80 years ago. He knew what you people did. He documented all of it. Brennan set down the papers with trembling hands. Do you understand what this means? If this becomes public, your company loses everything. The leases are invalid. The land reverts to its rightful owners. And Summit will owe 70 years of compensation for minerals extracted from stolen property. It would bankrupt us. Thousands of jobs lost. Multiple towns economically devastated. Should have thought about that before you built your empire on theft. Brennan pulled out his phone, made a call. I need you here now. Yes, all of them. We have a situation. Within an hour, the cabin was full of people. Summit CEO, their head legal counsel, 3 board members, and a crisis management consultant. They studied the documents with increasing alarm. Finally, the CEO, Victoria Ashbrook, addressed Mark directly. What do you want? That's not my decision to make. This is the Running Bear family's land. They get to decide what happens next. Mark called Nathan. Put him on speaker. Summit wants to negotiate. No negotiations, Nathan said firmly. We're filing suit tomorrow morning. Federal court, with full media coverage. The world is going to know what was done to our families. Ashbrook leaned toward the phone. Mr. Running Bear, I understand your anger, but please consider we can reach a settlement that restores your land rights and provides compensation without destroying an entire industry. Brennan went pale as he read. Mark watched him pick up the bribery list, saw his eyes widen when he recognized the names. Where did you find this? Where my grandfather hid it 80 years ago. He knew what you people did. He documented all of it. Brennan set down the papers with trembling hands. Do you understand what this means? If this becomes public, your company loses everything. The leases are invalid. The land reverts to its rightful owners. And Summit will owe 70 years of compensation for minerals extracted from stolen property. It would bankrupt us. Thousands of jobs lost. Multiple towns economically devastated. Should have thought about that before you built your empire on theft. Brennan pulled out his phone, made a call. I need you here now. Yes, all of them. We have a situation. Within an hour, the cabin was full of people. Summit CEO, their head legal counsel, 3 board members, and a crisis management consultant. They studied the documents with increasing alarm. Finally, the CEO, Victoria Ashbrook, addressed Mark directly. What do you want? That's not my decision to make. This is the Running Bear family's land. They get to decide what happens next. Mark called Nathan, put him on speaker. Summit wants to negotiate. No negotiations, Nathan said firmly. We're filing suit tomorrow morning. Federal court, with full media coverage. The world is going to know what was done to our families. Ashbrook leaned toward the phone. Mr. Running Bear, I understand your anger. But please consider we can reach a settlement that restores your land. Rights and provides compensation without destroying an entire industry. Thousands of people built their livelihoods on my family's stolen land. That's not my problem. It's yours. The line went dead. Ashbrook looked at Mark. Can you convince him to wait? Just 48 hours while we put together a serious offer? Mark thought about Ivy, about the life they could have. Thought about Daniel, who died trying to expose the truth. Thought about Joseph Running Bear, who'd spent 40 years fighting for justice and died without seeing it. I'll call him back, Mark said, but I'm not promising anything. Mark called Nathan after the Summit executives left. They want to negotiate. They're scared. Good. They should be. I think we should hear them out. Not because they deserve consideration, but because we need to understand their position before we go public. They agreed to a meeting at the tribal headquarters in 2 days. Mark spent those 48 hours organizing the evidence into an undeniable presentation photographs. Letters, official documents, all arranged chronologically to tell the complete story. Sheriff Dalton stopped by on the second morning. He looked tired, older somehow. I heard Summit's been here. That you found more documents. News travels fast. Small town. Dalton sat on the porch steps. My grandfather was one of the soldiers who stayed silent. He knew what happened to Wilson, you, and Hutchins. He knew they were killed for trying to expose the truth. And he said nothing because he was afraid. He pulled out a folder. These are my grandfather's papers. He kept records too not as detailed as Daniel's, but enough. Names, dates, the orders that came down. I'd like you to have them. Mark took the folder, feeling its weight. This will help. There's going to be a town meeting tonight, Dalton continued. Word got out about what he found. People want to talk. I don't know if that's a good idea. Maybe not, but they deserve a chance to be heard too. Not to justify what happened. There's no justifying it. But to acknowledge it, to take responsibility. That's part of healing. The town meeting filled the community center. Nearly 100 people, standing room only. Mark showed them everything. Daniel's photographs, the documents, the timeline of events. When he displayed the image of Joseph Running Bear's family being removed from their home, several people began crying. Vera stood up, her voice shaking. That's my father in that picture. The soldier standing in the background. He told me before he died that it was the worst thing he'd ever been part of. He said he should have stood with Daniel, but he was afraid. One by one, others stood to share their family stories. A grandson of one of the mining company executives who admitted his grandfather had spent his final years trying to make amends. A woman whose uncle had been part of the military detail, who'd left the service and never spoke of his time in Colorado. A man whose father had worked for the mining company and donated anonymously to native causes for 40 years. Trying to balance some cosmic ledger. Each testimony added weight, created collective acknowledgement. The town wasn't divided. It was unified in recognition of wrong done. Dr. Sterling finally stood, his voice steady despite his age. I've been thinking about this for 70 years. We have a chance now to do what should have been done in 1943, to acknowledge the truth, to make restitution, to honor the people who were harmed. The question is whether we have the courage to do it. A younger woman spoke up. But what about our jobs? Summit employs half this town. If they go under, what happens to us? That's the question, isn't it? Dalton said. Justice for one group means hardship for another. There's no easy answer. Mark took a deep breath. The Running Bear family doesn't want to destroy Pine Ridge. They want their land back. They want compensation for what was stolen, and they want the truth acknowledged. But they also understand that real people depend on that mining operation. So what's the solution? Someone asked. Partnership. The Running Bear family takes majority ownership of the land and mining rights. Summit continues operations, but under tribal oversight and with profit-sharing agreements. The town stays employed, but the wealth goes where it should have gone all along. The room erupted in discussion. Some supportive, others skeptical, many simply confused about how such an arrangement would work. Vera approached him after the meeting. My father left a letter to be opened after his death. He wanted it given to the Running Bear family, but I never knew how to find them. She handed Mark an envelope, yellowed with age. Maybe you can deliver it for him. Mark took it carefully. What does it say? I don't know. He sealed it 50 years ago and made me promise not to open it. But he said it was the truth he couldn't speak while he lived. That night, Mark opened the envelope. The letter was written in shaking handwriting, dated 1973. To the Running Bear family, I was there the day you were forced from your homes. I wore the uniform and followed the orders, and I have lived with that shame every day since. I cannot give you back what was taken, but I can give you the truth. Lieutenant Graves ordered the deaths of the 4 soldiers who tried to expose the operation. I heard him give the orders. I did nothing to stop it. I am a coward and a collaborator, and I will carry that burden to my grave. But I hope this testimony, given freely after all these years, will help bring some measure of justice to your family. You deserve better from us. You deserve better from America. I am sorry. It was signed by Gerald Hastings, witnessed and NOTARIZED. Mark added the letter to the growing pile of evidence. Each document, each photograph, each testimony added weight to the case. By morning, he'd collected over 50 new testimonies from Pine Ridge residents, dozens of photographs, and multiple sets of corporate documents. The people weren't defending the past anymore. They were exposing it. The drive to the tribal headquarters took 6 hours. Nathan was waiting with tribal council members, lawyers and elders, including Ruth, Joseph Running Bear's daughter. Mark set up his presentation in the tribal council chambers. The room was packed, standing room only. This wasn't just about one family's land claim anymore. This was about every indigenous family that had been displaced, every promise broken, every injustice buried beneath bureaucracy and time. He looked at Nathan, who nodded. Time to begin. Mark stood at the front of the tribal council chambers, acutely aware that the next hour would determine the outcome of 70 years of injustice. My name is Mark Corrigan. My great-grandfather was Daniel Corrigan, a soldier who tried to expose a terrible wrong and paid for it with his life. Today, we finish it. The first slide showed Daniel's photograph, young and hopeful in his uniform. Mark let the image sit for a moment before continuing. In June 1943, Daniel was assigned to Pine Ridge as part of a Corps of Engineers unit conducting geological surveys. The reality was something very different. He walked them through the timeline methodically. The secret mining surveys from February showing extensive uranium deposits. The internal memos discussing how to acquire the land. The agreement between the War Department and Mountain States Mining. Signed 4 months before the families were told anything. When he reached the photographs of the displacement, the room fell silent. Nathan stood next, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. The man in this photograph is my grandfather, Joseph Running Bear. He was 44 years old when soldiers came to his door and gave him 2 weeks to leave the land his family had owned for 60 years. He showed them his deed, proved his legal ownership. They took the deed and burned it in front of him. He held up a copy of the deed that Daniel had preserved. This is the only surviving proof that my grandfather's land was legally his. Without this, we've had no standing to challenge what was done to us. The government claimed we relocated voluntarily, that we were compensated fairly. Both were lies. Ruth stood next, her aged voice carrying across the silent room. I was 5 years old when they took us from our home. I remember my grandmother crying as soldiers set fire to our house. They told us it was temporary, that we could come back after the war. We never did. We lost everything, our land, our possessions, our sacred sites. And for 70 years, we've been told we had no proof, no legal claim, no right to demand justice. She turned to face the summit executives directly. You've built your wealth on my family's stolen property. Every dollar you've made, every ton of minerals you've extracted, all of it was built on theft. And you knew it. Victoria Ashbrook, Summit's CEO, stood slowly. Mrs. Running Bear, Summit Mining acknowledges the historical injustice done to your family and the other displaced families. The documents Mr. Corrigan has presented are deeply troubling. Troubling. Nathan's voice cut through her prepared statement. My family was erased from history, and you find that troubling? Ashbrook held up a hand. I'm not minimizing what happened. I'm trying to find a path forward that acknowledges the past while protecting the present. Summit employs over 400 people. If we simply shut down or transfer everything overnight, thousands of people lose their livelihoods. And my family lost everything. Nathan said quietly. Where was your concern for livelihoods then? Mark stepped forward. The question isn't whether an injustice occurred. The evidence makes that undeniable. The question is how we address it now, in a way that provides justice while minimizing harm to innocent people. One of Summit's lawyers spoke up. We're prepared to offer a settlement. Full acknowledgement of the historical wrong, compensation to the Running Bear family, and establishment of a memorial and educational center. What about the land? Nathan asked. The actual land that was stolen? The lawyer hesitated. We can negotiate partial ownership, profit-sharing arrangements. The land, Nathan repeated firmly. Not partial ownership. The land itself, returned to its rightful owners. That's 3,000 acres of actively mined property worth billions of dollars. It was stolen from us. You're operating on land you never legally owned. One of the tribal lawyers stood. Under federal law, indigenous land rights supersede subsequent claims when the original taking was fraudulent. The documents prove both fraud and treaty violations. The land reverts to the Running Bear family, and Summit owes compensation for 70 years of unauthorized extraction. The Summit legal team conferred urgently. Their head counsel spoke. If we pursue this in court, it will take a decade to resolve. Is that really what you want? What we want, Nathan said, is what was taken from us. Our land, our dignity, our history acknowledged instead of erased. Martin stood. We have a proposal. The Running Bear family and other displaced families receive full legal title to the land, all 3,000 acres. Summit continues mining operations, but as a contractor working for us, not as the owner. Profits are split, with the majority going to the tribal families. Summit gets to stay in business. Pine Ridge keeps its jobs, and we finally get what should have been ours 70 years ago. The room erupted in discussion. Ashbrook conferred with her lawyers. We need time to review the proposal. How much time? Nathan asked. A week. Maybe 2. You have 48 hours, Nathan said firmly. After that, we file suit in federal court. You'll lose in court. The evidence is too clear. But you'll also lose in public opinion. Every news outlet will run stories about a mining company built on stolen native land. Mark added, I have Gerald Hastings' testimony naming Lieutenant Graves as the person who ordered the murders of 4 soldiers. Graves later became your director of security. If this goes to trial, that connection becomes public. The blood drained from Ashbrook's face. 48 hours. We'll have an answer. As people filed out, Ruth approached Mark and took his hands. Your grandfather was a good man. He tried to help when no one else would. Thank you for finishing his work. Mark felt tears in his eyes. I just followed the trail he left. That's all any of us can do. Follow the trail left by those who came before, and hope we leave a good trail for those who come after. The 48 hours felt endless. On the morning of the second day, Sheriff Dalton called. You need to come back to Pine Ridge, now. They arrived to find the town square filled with people. Tables covered with documents and photographs. Poster boards displaying the timeline from 1943. Vera saw him first. We're bearing witness, all of us. After the town meeting, people started really talking. We realized staying silent made us complicit. Dr. Sterling approached with a thick folder. We've been collecting testimonies from everyone whose family was here in 1943. Everyone who knew something and stayed quiet. They're coming forward now. By mid-morning, they'd collected over 50 new testimonies, dozens of photographs, and multiple sets of documents. The people of Pine Ridge weren't defending the past, they were exposing it. Sheriff Dalton stood on the town hall steps. For 70 years, this town has carried a secret. Today, we're choosing truth over comfort, justice over convenience. Mark's phone rang. Nathan. Summit just called. They want to meet. Today, they're ready to negotiate. Meet them here. In Pine Ridge, let them see what happens when a community chooses truth. 3 hours later, Victoria Ashbrook and her team drove through the town square, past the tables of evidence and crowds holding photographs. They met in the community center, surrounded by testimony they couldn't dispute. Ashbrook stood. "This is our proposal. Full legal title to the 3,000 acres, transfers to the Running Bear family and other displaced families. Summit continues mining under a 20-year contract. Profits split 60-40 in favor of the tribal families." "What about back compensation?" Nathan asked. $200 million in immediate compensation, with an additional $50 million for a tribal education and healthcare fund. The room went silent. Nathan didn't look satisfied. "You're buying legitimacy." "We're acknowledging a debt," Ashbrook corrected. "We can't change what happened, but we can try to make amends." Martin leaned forward. "What about public acknowledgement?" "We'll fund the Memorial and Historical Center. We'll establish the Daniel Corrigan Foundation, dedicated to investigating corporate misconduct." Ruth spoke. "Why now? Why agree to terms that will cost billions?" Ashbrook met her gaze. "Because we've already lost. The evidence is overwhelming. This way, we stay in business, keep people employed, and try to build something better." Nathan conferred with the tribal council. Finally, he spoke. 3 additions. First, Summit publicly acknowledges its operations were built on fraudulently seized land. Second, the murdered soldiers are honored with a memorial. Third, hiring preferences for tribal members. Ashbrook nodded. "Agreed." She added the provisions and signed. Nathan held the pen for a long moment. "My grandfather died believing justice would never come." "You're settling for what's achievable," Mark said gently. "Perfect justice is impossible, but meaningful justice, that's within reach." Nathan sighed. Then Ruth. Then each council member. When the last signature was added, the room erupted in applause. Ashbrook shook Nathan's hand. "I hope this is the beginning of a better relationship." "We'll be watching to make sure it is," Nathan replied. Outside, Pine Ridge was celebrating with relief. The burden they'd carried for 70 years was lifting. Ivy stood beside Mark. "Is it over?" "The hardest part is, now comes the work of healing." That evening, the town gathered at Daniel's cabin. Someone had cleaned the memorial plaque. People added flowers, photographs, handwritten notes. Mark added his own. "We finished it, Grandpa. The truth is free now. Rest well." 6 months later, Mark stood on the cabin porch watching spring return to the mountains. The roof no longer leaked. The generator hummed reliably. But the most important changes weren't visible. The cabin had been designated a historical landmark, centerpiece of the Running Bear Memorial and Education Center. School groups visited twice a week to learn about the displacement, the cover-up, and the eventual restoration of justice. Ivy came out carrying coffee. Nearly 12 now, taller and more confident. Nathan called. "The memorial dedication is set for next month. They want you to speak. Tell Grandpa Daniel's story," she said, "so people remember that one person can make a difference." The settlement had been finalized in January. The Running Bear family held legal title to 3,000 acres, with Summit operating as a contractor under tribal oversight. The $200 million payment had been distributed among the families. But more importantly, the truth was public record. News outlets had covered the story nationwide. Documentary filmmakers requested archive access. Universities developed curricula around the case. Pine Ridge had changed too. Summit still operated, still employed the same workers. But now there was tribal oversight, environmental standards, and work done with consent rather than on stolen ground. Nathan's truck appeared. The old man visited monthly, sometimes bringing family to see where their history had been preserved. "Morning, Mark. Ivy." He settled into a porch chair. Beautiful day. They sat in comfortable silence. Finally, Nathan spoke. I've been thinking about forgiveness. Whether it's possible, whether it's right. What conclusion have you reached? That forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about refusing to let the past poison the future. He gestured toward the mountains. My grandfather spent 40 years angry, but now I'm not angry anymore. I'm grieving what was lost, but hopeful about what we're building. Nathan pulled out an envelope. This is from the tribal council. We've decided to name you and Ivy as honorary members. You're family now. Mark's throat tightened. I don't know what to say. Say you'll keep telling the story. Say you'll make sure people remember that truth matters, even when it's buried for 70 years. We will. I promise. That evening, Ivy worked on her homework, an essay about family history. How should I end it? Mark thought. Maybe that secrets have a cost, but truth can heal. And that ordinary people, when they choose courage over comfort, can change history. Ivy wrote, then read aloud. My great-great-grandfather died trying to do the right thing. He left evidence because he believed someone would care enough to look. He was right. Truth was buried for 70 years, but it didn't die. Truth survives, waiting for someone brave enough to speak it. That's when I learned that one person's courage echoes through generations, and it's never too late to make things right. That's perfect, sweetheart. Later, Mark sat on the porch in darkness. The mountains were silhouettes against brilliant stars. The cabin creaked in the wind. Settling into its role as guardian of memory. He messaged Nathan. Thank you for trusting me with your family story. Thank you for showing what justice looks like when pursued with wisdom. And thank you for teaching me that healing is possible. The response came quickly. Thank you for giving my grandfather his voice back. Sleep well, brother. Mark looked at the stars. We finished it. The truth is free now. Rest well. Inside, the cabin held its secrets no longer. The sealed panel stood open. The foundation had yielded its documents. Every shadow brought to light. Tomorrow, children would come to learn about what happened here, about the price of silence and the power of truth. They would see Daniel's work, understand his sacrifice. And maybe they would carry that understanding forward. The cabin had cost $100, but the truth it held was priceless. And the justice it helped achieve, worth more than any amount of money. In her room, Ivy slept peacefully in a home that was truly theirs. Tomorrow they would continue telling the story, honoring the memory, building the future on acknowledged truth. But tonight, they could rest. The burden carried, the promise kept, the truth spoken, and that was enough. It was everything.